Okay, so our first review of the day is going to be for Alan Wake 2. Alan Wake 2 is a sequel 13 years later from the very first Alan Wake game. And it still follows the Alan Wake character there, the titular character, with some new added additions, some other characters that kind of come in here. Most importantly, a FBI agent by the name of Saga Anderson. So what's happening in this Alan Wake 2 is that you have after kind of you see that Alan Wake has basically disappeared there after the events of the first game for these 13 years. And then all of these kind of murders start popping up there in the old town of Bright Falls there, which was the main town in the first Alan Wake game there. And you see that kind of, and also I didn't know the actual state, so it's Bright Falls, Washington. Is that what I actually? Yeah,
Yes.
so it's good old
You can
Washington.
see in Control, actually, there's a map of like locate or like a FBC test sites at one point on a big wall. It's got the whole country mapped out, and you can see a Bright Falls, Washington, actually on the wall up there.
Okay. So yeah, so you got then Bright Phones Washington there, and then Saga with her partner, who's played by Sam Lake here in this, who's Alex Casey, comes to investigate these murders. That's when they kind of get into all the weird things happening in this town, the return of Alan Wake, what this means, and also a bunch of other crazy unfolding events that also happen in the weird town of Bright Falls there. This is going to be a spoiler discussion for this. This game is already close to being 2 years old already. It dropped in 2023. It was nominated for a bunch of awards there. I think also it was nominated for Game of the Year, I believe it was as well there. So it's
Yeah, it
nominated.
was nominated for Game of the Year. It won Best Narrative, Best Direction, and I was it Best Performance. I think it won those three, and then it was nominated for Game of the Year, but it didn't win that one.
Yes, and it lost to which? You remember which game it lost to? I
I
think it was
believe it was
Baldur's Gate 3.
Baldur's Gate. Yep.
Yeah, it was
Yep.
Baldur's Gate 3 it lost to. So hey, not bad to lose to Baldur's Gate 3. It's not bad to lose to that. I'm gonna pass around to you guys. Get your thoughts on it. Sage, and No Name. What are your thoughts on Alan Wake 2? Spoiler, yeah.
Please tell me to shut up if I go on too long here. Uh, this game was something I'd anticipated for a long time. I mean, leading up to something to Control coming out in 2019, I mean, I was at a point where I definitely had given up on the hope of there ever being a sequel. Like, I definitely at that point was like, all right, well, that was a great special thing, and it seemed like it was setting up a sequel, and I guess we'll never find out what's going on there. And then Control came out, surprised us all by being in the same universe, and it very clearly set up this announcement for the second game. And then, 13 years later, we have it, and for being as big a fan of the first game as I was, and having so much time to theorize and wonder and speculate and make these guesses as to what could they possibly do and how interesting could this get. It would be very easy for a piece of media that you wait 13 years for to be disappointing or underwhelming or just not all of what you thought it might be. And for me, this was, one of those great examples of the total opposite, where it shattered every expectation I had for another game. And part of that is the fact that it is, in some ways, similar to the first game, in that it is a meta commentary on the development of itself. So, you go into this game, and Quantum Break was something that Remedy made because they couldn't make an Alan Wake 2 right away. So, in terms of, the story being about these dark places that an artist goes when they're obsessively trying to perfect their craft and to, create something that is this, ever evolving piece of work. It incorporates Max Payne, Quantum Break, Control in all these really interesting ways because it is the story of its own creation in many ways, and it manages to both be a satisfying Alan Wake story, and also a really satisfying story about the Remedy connected universe as a whole. I've compared it, I think, before to Captain America: Civil War. Funny enough, in that I think that movie does a great job of telling you this Captain America story and having that be the strong through line, and yet there are so many other threads and characters that have their own arcs, and yet they don't take away from what the kind of overall greater point of it is and from who the titular character is. So I mean, there's a lot of amazing stuff here, and I'm sure we'll get into it. But for me, it's one of those magical experiences that like it there was almost nothing it could have done to succeed my expectations more than it already had.
No name. He's got the Alan Wake setup already with there.
Yeah, it clearly
Fantastic.
a very impactful game for me. Probably my favorite game in. I didn't look to actually make sure this is true, but about probably 5 years. I loved every second of it. I've played through it, I think, 4 times, not quite as much as I believe Sage's six, if I remember
Yeah,
right.
I've completed it 6 full times.
Okay. Yeah, so 4 times through. First time, uh, on a computer that is way below minimum specs. It has since been patched that my computer will be able to play it. But even playing it on something where it was struggling the whole time, I was just so hungry for all of that lore, all of those little interconnected bits. I mean, I was kind of putting this up as a bit and then got lost track of time having fun, just like, and started theorizing on an actual conspiracy board for the just set piece. But I think that it's a game that really, like, obviously Alan Wake coming back into the universe 13 years later, like, he is, to some extent, other than the couple people he knows, devoid of connections at this point. And it is a game so made by its side characters. The Koskela brothers, obviously Rose, a fan favorite coming back. Um, Ati showing up here, and that connection, as well as, let me see if I'm forgetting. Oh, Estevez's introduction, and then being flushed out in the Lake House DLC. I thought was such a cool like expansion of the FBC. Show us a rank and file member, instead of Jesse's experience, coming in and suddenly being director. And it felt like, which this kind of the same thing that drew me into Alan Wake 1. It felt like, in some ways, more like reading or more like a literature thing where there's these layers to analyze, there's the surface story, there's meaning behind it, meaning behind the development, and it's commenting on all of that. I love that interplay there.
Mm. Yeah, and you mentioned so this is a much bigger game than what the first Alan Wake was, much longer, much more expansive there. Obviously 13 years later, much better looking game than we had in the first Alan Wake.
One of the
And
best looking games maybe released, period,
Yeah,
so far.
phenomenal.
really good, yeah, with the game. I played some of the footage there with the environments, the lighting of it, how they really utilize the darkness, and then also this ability you use in the game with light, how they play around with that is also really interesting. And how the first Alan Wake is described it more as an action kind of horror game here. This is more survival horror. It's more closer to akin to something more like maybe Resident Evil 2 or maybe like a Silent Hill 2 there. It's more akin to something like that, as opposed to more of an action horror type title. They're like maybe Resident Evil 5, like that. So, yeah, and very much here you still have some of these creatures there, but the way you interact with them is different than in the first game there with the light and how you still use it to shine on them, but that's even the way that how that's used is very differently there. The way they go down is a little bit more difficult. Now I played it on hard my first time. Did it that way instead of doing normal mode, so that may have skewed my perspective on that a little bit there. But you mentioned like how it's kind of like the civil war of the Remedy universe there, of connecting all these pieces of like all the other different Remedy games, Control, the also the other Alan Wake game, also stuff like with Quantum Break, which was also thrown in here, and then also their very one of their first big hits, which was Max Payne with the Alex Casey, which is a basically the same character as Max Payne, and how they kind of played with that. He's played by Sam Lake. I think that's really good there. So the way this kind of starts off as being like this mystery and this investigation of these murders there and who's behind the murders in this town and with the FBI agents brings me, to talk about one of my newer favorite characters in the whole Remedy universe, Saga Anderson, and then No Name has the whole thing of hers in his background there, where you're, the one of the new mechanics in this game that get introduced is the Mind Palace, where she's able to go and, basically what you see in a lot of detective type movies there, where characters
Like
have all
Sherlock Holmes.
Sherlock
Hmm.
Holmes, where characters have the information on the board and they're on the wall and they're looking over it and everything like that. So you're able to do that, and then it'll kind of, you're able to go there and piece together clues. And the game won't let you move on until you piece together all the clues and you get it, because it has to lead you to the next step of the information for her to reveal it. And here's a little bit of an example there of it, like what you're doing there with it, which I thought was very cool. I thought that was a very, very cool mechanic that they did with that. What did you think about some of the newer mechanics added in the game?
There was one
I mean, I
moment.
think.
Oh, go
Oh,
ahead,
sorry.
Sage.
Oh, well, I was just gonna say, I think this is a great mechanic because even though I feel like I understand everything going on, I've picked apart these games for years, waiting for this game, and so like I feel like I have an intuitive kind of like field to take in all this new information. Some This might be some people's first Remedy game. They might just check this out on a whim, and they might not have played any of the others. And I think having this case board is a really smart way of going. Slow down, double check everything you've heard, because there's a lot of information here, and
Hmm.
it could be easy to get lost if you didn't have something like this to kind of make you stop and go like, okay, hold on, let me process this. And Alan has his own version, which he just in terms of mentioning new mechanics, but there's just this great way of, in the first game, you had the story that was very much about rewriting reality and drafts of fiction and kind of all this kind of meta storytelling commentary, but it never played a role in the gameplay. Here, you actually, as the player, during Alan's sequences, are rewriting reality on the fly and changing the environment around you. So they've taken what was such a great story conceit and actually applied it to the gameplay and design kind of. I've actually never seen these exact mechanics in any game before, where you just flip the entire environment around and just change it and morph it to create these pathways forward. That to me is completely new for this game.
Hmm. What do you think?
Um, yeah, So there was one moment watching when you were playing where you said something. It was like, can someone just get Saga a second or third screen and a good Excel document? And I had to laugh at that because for me, as soon as I interacted with the case board and the writer's room stuff, something clicked and I actually implemented it here for my own writing, because visually processing that information in a physical space somehow is different for me. I love organizing things on digitally, and that's absolutely the most efficient way to process information like that. There's something about moving it around and making the connections with your hands that even while I was doing this, I was realizing these connections. Oh, that has to go there. Like that wouldn't come off immediately just thinking about that character, or whatever aspect it is. So I think, yeah, really cool mechanic. That was the one place where I had issues on my first playthrough, because the background world keeps running and keeps doing its thing while you're on the case board or the writer's room, and so I got some slowdown there. But yeah, as a mechanic, as a visualization of both the like creative process that they're making this sub commentary on, as well as getting you involved in Alan's, each different iteration of the theme of spiral or loop in this game. I loved that mechanic.
Yeah. And you mentioned the mechanics. So, Saga has her detective kind of room there, palace there, mind place. Alan Wake has his writer's room where he uses it to rewrite reality, as Sage was mentioning there, where he'll connect it to write an actual story. Um, and he's able to kind of figure out more of his abilities and what he can do there in this game, and more, like I said, more expanding the lore there from the first Alan Wake game, which I thought was really cool. Um, and I thought that was really well done. Yeah, I mean, and it's really, I mean, there's some other characters in here, but it's really both equally Alan Wake's game as much as it is Saga's game there and their stories. And there's even information, and we're going to get into it, of what you learn about Saga and her backstory and her family history there that kind of comes into things, which I thought was very interesting. And then, not even mentioning the big overall villain antagonist of this being Mr. Scratch, and who is Mr. Scratch, and what I mean, what his overall motive and goals are, and everything like that. I thought that was also really well done, and also this great mystery that unfolds from this. And much as we talked about it, when we talked about David Lynch and reviewing Mulholland Drive, and when David Lynch passed away, how much influence he had on video games, particularly the Remedy universe. There, Sam Blake even mentioned that in one of his speeches, how much David Lynch had an influence on him with stuff like Twin Peaks. And I'm watching Twin Peaks right now. I'm going through the series, and watching David Lynch movies, and you can definitely feel that on here. The way kind of this mystery, all the way it slowly unfolds. I think it's beautifully well told and well kind of performed there, which I thought was really good. What did you think about just the way the story kind of unfolds and the way where it goes? Were you kind of ever like, oh, I know this is maybe going to happen, or
it is like I would say that I'm someone that is hard to surprise generally because I feel like I see so many things, and it's not a matter of even it's not a matter at all of being able to see things coming because I'm particularly smart. Even it's just a matter of you see so many things, you just start to recognize patterns. And so the more stories you consume, the less surprised you are. I think the less often, and I think this consistently, I didn't know where it was going for the most part. I mean, there's maybe a few moments where there's a scare that might be a little telegraphed, or then I'm like, oh, I bet they'll put something around that corner. But when it comes to the actual plot, and just the way that it unfolds, I think it's pretty consistently surprising. And part of it is also, with Alan's half in particular, being able to rely on this space that operates on dream logic. And I think you're able to kind of inherently craft something that is less predictable because you are kind of unbound by the rules of physical space. And it allows you to create these kind of weirder, more esoteric sequences. I mean, I'm sure we'll get into it later, but just in terms of how this game evolves, the Tom Zane mystery, like I think you are more confused after this game than you've ever been in this franchise, at least when it comes to that character.
mm, what do you say there, Nona?
I I really resonate with what Sage said, and the like Alan's story being discover, like you were talking about Alan's story being discovery of his powers, how things work, realizing that he's been taking echoes of the real world, um, and he is writing this story to escape, obviously, but also figuring out how things work. And then Saga, who's not an antagonist, is pushing against that story, saying, no, my daughter didn't die, and like that, these things don't make sense. I didn't live here, whatever. Putting that friction between them and they're both pursuing the same goal of everyone getting out safe. I think is really a really cool dynamic between the two of them, especially once you reach the point where they're interacting with each other. And then that only deepens as you go farther into what has actually happened over time.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's beautifully well told. I think the story. I see why it was ended up winning best narrative there, of the way that they were to handle all these kind of multiple things going on with all these different characters, all these different stories, leaving what I mean, these threads for can't wait to see what follows gets followed up in the next game in Island Week 3 there. See that. So I think that's also very very interesting there.
And you can play it in different orders too. I think the fact that it works no matter whose story you're playing in what section is another layer on that.
Yeah,
because
and
you could stick to Alan and play his entire half of the game,
Mm-hmm.
and then do sagas, or vice versa. You can play her entire half of the game and then jump over. And no matter which one you as a player decide to stick with, the story makes just as much sense no matter what.
Yeah. Yeah, good that you bring that up. Yeah, so you do have the ability to go back and forth, just change between the characters. Because for the most part of the game, you have Alan who's stuck in like this. They call it, what is it? What's the name
The
for it?
dark place is like the actual kind of name the dimension is given. There's a lot of speculation as to like, is it the collective unconscious? We know it's the spiral door from the Ocean View Motel in Control. It is, kind of based on the Night Springs DLC. It's also kind of maybe given the name the Sea of Night. There's a few different terms that are kind of thrown around, but the dark place is the term that's used like across the whole first game, and I feel like is the most
Mm-hmm.
consistent one. But there's, I think even after this game is over, there is still speculation to be had on the true nature of this place.
Hmm. Yeah. So he's
Mm-hmm.
mostly spending time in the dark place there, trapped. And then so the game almost kind of time wise, you see it where there's a sequence where he kind of pops up there, but then you realize that of who that truly is, and then that he's kind of still stuck in a place. So the dark place there, and then so Saga is operating more in the real world. We see her there investigating the case and then trying to crack it, and then leading all to all these clues, and then learning more and more about herself, even with this case, and her origins, as No Name mentioned. Um, so yeah, this is Alan Wake 2 is just basically Alan Wake but bigger, in every sense of the word. I mean, this also reportedly had a $70 million budget there, reportedly making one of the more expensive games to ever be developed there with this. And that's an estimated total. It's not an exact number there. Nobody knows, I guess, the exact number, but that's an estimated total there. Now it sold over 1.8 million units by November of 2024. That's how many it is there. I was able to get it on sale there. I was able to get it. It was a deal going on during the holidays for $40. So I was able to pick it up there, plus the DLC, which this has two DLCs. It has Night Springs and Lake House there. I picked those both up for $10 together, so making a total price of $50, which I think is a great price for this game. If you can get it, but if you paid $70, I think you'd still be. I think there's a lot of game
Mm-hmm.
in here. If you pay the full price, I think this game's length, if you play it and try to do everything, is about 25 plus hours. About
Yeah, yeah. If you do everything, like every little
Mm-hmm.
thing, I'd say you're probably hitting 30, 32.
Yeah, so if you do
Yeah.
everything, that's really great. The visuals of this game look really gorgeous. I think all the way there with that. I love the visuals of this. I think the combat in here is much more improved there. That was one of the things you told me going into the first Alan Wake game, was
Yep.
that it's older game, very clunky. Game like you said, 13 years older, very kind of clunky kind of game. Here, the combat is much more refined, much better here. The dodging is much better with this
More or
game.
less plays like Resident Evil 2 remake. It's got
Yeah,
that kind of style of over the shoulder survival horror. And I would say the big thing is just in terms of pacing the combat. Because the first game it's like combat, 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 cutscene, combat, combat,
Mm-hmm.
combat. Here it's like slow, moody, atmospheric scene, cutscene, investigation scene, puzzle, then a combat scene, then maybe another investigation scene. there's this much greater variety in what you spend your time doing compared to the first game. Whereas in the first game, it's like if you had your hands on the controller, you were doing combat. You were doing combat, or you were
Yeah.
walking in between two combat scenes. Here, there's all these different kinds of things that you do that kind of break up the pacing or give you this different sense of accomplishment. I mean, at one point you walked through a musical like that. That's
Right.
an entire scene in this.
My one note on the comment was that it stays out of its own way. Alan Wake was a lot of the commentary or criticism was around the combat. For the first game, I think it it is the point that you're anticipating in some ways. It's the point that's building, but those in between moments are still tense because you're like, oh, I found this spot I can get items that will build me up for that next combat instead of Alan Wake 1 that was giving you items to support its constant combat. It wasn't anticipatory, it wasn't building tension.
Having less of it makes it matter a lot more.
Yeah, exactly.
And for the most part, I mean, combat is really good there. I mean, I played on hard mode. I don't think it's, even if you play it on hard mode, it's that. I mean, there's some hard spots in here. I died a lot at this sequence. I don't know why, but I died. Maybe I was too busy listening to the music, but I died a lot
It's
here.
great music.
It is
Yeah.
great music. That's another thing at this game too. Great music in this game as well.
Oh, the music choices in Remedy games is so key, so important. And this one being, I think all of it, or at least most of it, was specifically made for the game. Which
It is all of it.
For knowing the community and being community driven and knowing people are streaming these games, that allows them to play the whole experience for people. But it also has this extra in-world feel where these songs are maybe songs that are in-world on Pat Main's radio show or something like that. I think that, and the through line of Poe's, I think 6-part This Road, which plays as a couple different chapter and scene changes, I think musically is really cool, and that artist's story is very interestingly tied in to the Lake House DLC.
Okay.
And this was the first time, Remedy's always used a lot of music in their games. Poets of the Fall, famously, they did basically an original track of music called Late Goodbye for Max Payne 2, all the way back in 2003, and they've been a part of every Remedy game ever since. They did the great Take Control for the Ashtray Maze, In Control. They did all these old Gods of Asgard songs in Alan Wake 1. But I think what really elevates Alan Wake 2 as a soundtrack above any previous Remedy game is they have all these great Poets of the Fall, old Gods of Asgard songs, but this game is the first time Remedy basically brought on board an entire record label just to produce music for this game. So there's a whole bunch of artists between old Gods of Asgard, Poe, and a number of other musicians here. They are, they have like almost an in-house record label producing all this music for the game. So it's not just score like a lot of games would be. I mean, these are lyrical songs that are written. It almost reminds me of, a lot of films in the 1980s would have a lot of songs written, and the songs would kind of be telling the story of the movie. And I think in modern Hollywood, we don't see that so much anymore. But that's what Remedy is doing here is these songs tell the story of the game, even if you were to just listen to the songs and not even play the game.
So Alan Wake's songs are the 2020s Axel F, is what you're saying?
Yes.
Yeah, you mentioned, part of the storytelling is one song with the old Gods of Asgard that come into play there to tell the story of how they met a certain person and how they kind of fell out with them. So if you listen to that whole song, yeah.
One of the things, so I'm glad you said that specifically. One of the things I wanted to bring out is the song Poet in the Muse from the first game. There's a line that's referenced in a line of dialogue in this game where Odin says to Thor something about like, we left the door cracked open, bro. And I was recently listening to Poet and the Muse, and I think that he's referring to in that song, they say at the very end, they may still haunt this place. I think that left the door cracked open for all of these next recurring Altered World events where they wanted to finish it, but because they needed their art to be true, they have this line at the end that creates the whole interweaving web of the RCU, as far as we can see it right now.
I greatly enjoyed this game a lot. You know what I mean? I love what this game did. Like I said, I mean, it's Alan Wake 1, but bigger. And the way they're able to handle, all these different stories in it is really amazing. Love the new addition with the Saga character and where she goes in this. Love the look of this game. This is, like I said, gorgeous looking game here. The look of this game. The facial models look really good as well. Those look really gorgeous as well. The environments look really gorgeous. The music is really fantastic with this. The story, the way it unfolds is absolutely really great. The combat is much better, I said, compared to the first one there. Like you said, much more Resident Evil 2 there with this one. Um, and a good variety of weapons you can use there with this as well. Like I said, I don't think it has not as much combat as the first one does. There's still some really good combat sequences though. Different from the first one. There's actual boss fights in this one compared to the first one there. And the boss fights are good. I mean, they're pretty challenging at some point. There was the one that to me was the most challenging was the one with Saga where she fights the two sheriffs there. That one was really a little frustrating one there, but not too frustrating that you couldn't get one. I mean, and much like with a lot of Remedy games, they do have one big, battle boss sequence there in the game that's really like probably the most fun to play. That was one with Saga again, where she has to fight all these different possessed people there, and plus with the music playing from the old gods of Asgard, and then also, you know what I mean, with Mr. Scratch that's going to be coming there as the main villain. So I thought that sequence was the big, they usually do the big blowout sequence of the game, and that was really great there. And I
It
like
felt like this game graduated because it had two instead of just one. Like Alan Wake 1, you've got the big concert scene, it's one big sequence. At Control, you've got the Ashbury Maze, it's one big sequence. And then in this one, you had the whole
We
musical
Sing.
level with Alan, and Saga then got that big concert stage
Totally.
sequence closer to the end of the game. So, I mean, if that's any indication of the future, like we might get more and more of those sorts of kind of big, epic, like let's go all out moments in like Control 2. Maybe we get three sequences like that, you know?
Yeah. And this is the moment right here in the game, moment I'm talking about. So yeah, you're just fighting all these different enemies with coming out. I'll play a little bit of the music here, a little bit. So you get all the ammo and all you need, everything like that to fight these creatures. Yeah. And like I said, great soundtrack. I played this sequence a couple times here. I died some bit, but it wasn't fun. It wasn't not bad dying because I get to hear it again. It's a great song there. And I even downloaded the soundtrack.
I can't think of any other game where I would say go look at those lyrics, analyze those songs. Like there's so much lore in there. There's so much to be nitpicked out of there. And as Sam Lake has said, like they might not have even intended for some of those meanings to track onto other parts of the story, but it goes so deep. It goes so deep.
I'll point out one in that song right there is that Odin and Tor, both throughout the first game and the second game, consistently refer to Alan as Tom every time they interact with him or talk about him. In those lyrics, when they say just like a land awake, it's kind of the one time they actually refer to Alan by the name Alan Wake.
Alan Wake. Whoa, totally.
A land awake.
Yeah, I mean, I've got on my board here, I've got Mr. Dor, Ati, and Tor and Odin Anderson in the same category here because I think that, especially through the course of this game, they are a big power now.
Yeah. So let's get into spoilers there more. Sage, there you probably be better at describing a lot of what happens here at the end of this game and the whole big wrap of it. So what spoilers there you think would be great to discuss?
Oh, well, no, no, interrupt me if there's anything really major you feel like I'm leaving out. But, in terms of the way this game plays out, Saga comes here in here and she's investigating these murders, and she kind of slowly gets onto the trace of this cult, and we jump back and forth between her
Mm-hmm.
investigating this cult and Alan slowly kind of trying to find his way around the dark place.
Words.
You have Alan having these kind of very bizarre and up for interpretation meetings with Tom Zane in the dark place. Um, and you have ultimately these storylines kind of cross over, whereas as Alan is able to escape, Saga gets thrown into this dark
Mm-hmm.
place, into this world, and it's also very interesting to see them navigate each other's play spaces, both from a story point of view and a game mechanic point of view.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but you end up continuing this narrative of Alan, and I really think you know there's all this lore and there's all these like double meanings and meta layers. But to simplify it, I mean, one half of the story is about an artist going to this dark place mentally in this kind of long journey to perfect a piece of work. And in that more kind of real world meaning, it's really about how consumed you can be by a project and how just obsessed you can become with it to where you let your kind of human attachments to people kind of fall to the wayside. Well, this is happening, and a lot of that I think is really meaningful if you've ever really spent a lot of time working on a project, or spent years trying to get this thing right and feel like you're it's never quite working. And then Saga is, it's less on the art side, but she has this wonderful story. She's a mother. She has this, great story about, pushing against these kind of tides that keep hitting her, knowing where she knows what the truth is, but there it's kind of at every turn she's being told something other than what she knows to be the case, and that brings in this familial connection with the old
And
gods
if
and
one of
aspects
those
of it.
pieces are true, even one of those pieces are true, it might mean
Yeah,
that the horrible point of Logan is true. So
absolutely.
so even the actually true Tor or specifically Odin Anderson connection, she doesn't want that to be true because because it's new information to her, it feels like it would be leading her down the path to find out that everything she's heard about Logan is true. I think that
Yeah,
driving
no,
force, like Logan, is one of the like completely an off-screen character is is kind of the central character of the whole thing.
Mm.
On its surface level, at the very least.
no, that completely makes sense. And of course that brings in that familial connection too. And that's a point I would like to bring up is, in a way, Remedy's had all, this is like the eighth game they've made overall since Death Rally in the 90s. And in a certain way, because this is the first game where I feel like we're picking up on a mythology that already exists rather than establishing a completely new mythology. I would actually say that Saga Anderson is maybe Remedy's first true legacy character,
Mm.
in terms of like telling this ongoing story. It's like Alan Wake had to set up Alan Wake, Control had to set up Jesse, Max Payne had to set up Max Payne, but Alan Wake 2 was able to take this whole family tree of the old gods and introduce a new character that is genuinely a part of the legacy of this story that's been happening for 10 plus years. And I think that's another thing that makes her a really special and interesting new character, because it feels like
Mm-hmm.
it's not just a here's a new story and we were inspired by this and this. It's a sequel, and it is a building block where you can say, hey, we're not just inspired by other people's storytelling. we have a legacy of our own that we're carrying forward within the character of Saga,
Yeah.
and I think that really makes her this really valuable and special and interesting character to follow into this world with.
And you
Um,
need
and
her
I
because
think you'd need
Alan
her,
on
yeah.
his own can't hold after all this time. Alan on his own, I think, can't hold the whole story of a sequel. Like, what has he been doing this whole time? What we could play through that. It's so much more compelling to see that interplay, how what he's writing affects the real world. Her coming in as an unknown, I think, is crucial to how well this story was told.
100%. And I think it's also a matter of not only is it more interesting to see it from outside his perspective and to see what effect he's actually having on the world and other people and like what's the human cost of what he's doing. And we get some hints at it in Control as well, but we really get to see like a human price being paid for what Alan is actually doing in this world. And on top of that, let's just say hypothetically, this is the first time you've played a Remedy game, so you don't know anything going in. Saga's your anchor point. She is the character you understand, um, experiencing the story. So I think there's a lot of ways and a lot of different pillars in which she is this integral aspect of the experience, which I like. I don't think you could not take her out and have this story work anywhere near as well. And of course, talking about her lineage, since we're in the territory now, we also get, not 100% outright sedated, but it very, very strongly implied that her father is Mr. Door,
Mm-hmm.
which is another really interesting aspect of this because like I said before, in terms of this game, feels like it tells this Alan Wake story and it's very satisfying and it has a self-contained narrative that does play out. It is also a Max Payne sequel. It's also a Quantum Break
Mm-hmm.
sequel in these interesting ways. Um, and in the Mr. Door character, you really get this kind of direct continuation of the Quantum Break narrative. And there's even, anybody that's played Quantum Break will know that, the character Martin Hatch was played by Lance Reddick, who unfortunately passed away. But he was intended to play the Mr. Door character in Alan Wake 2 before he had fallen ill. And I think this scene that you're playing footage of right now, Josh, before he fully walks up, when Alan first comes into the room, there's a shot of him in silhouettes, and you can't actually see his actual facial features. It, to me, it kind of looks like it's framed as though it kind of looks like it is Lance Reddick for just a moment. Like there's just a brief second where it's like if you didn't know any better, you might think that
Mm-hmm.
that's Lance Reddick sitting there. And that's also I think the interesting thing about this moment because Mr. Door is kind of playing a role throughout most of his screen time in this game. He's very jovial. He does the musical number. He's playing this very affable talk show host. But then in this moment, it's almost like you're getting a glimpse of what his true personality is. And in that moment, in the cadence in which he speaks and his mannerisms, and even just the physicality of how he walks forward, it's shockingly close to how Lance Reddick
Mm-hmm.
played the Martin Hatch character in Quantum Break. Um, like I said, please tell me to speed up if I'm going on too long or going on too much about certain details. But I do think there's a lot to unpack here. Um, and then to flip it back over to the Allen half, once you really start to see him dealing with Mr. Scratch close to the end of the game here, I think that's where something like American Nightmare is really relevant to have played going into this game because in a lot of ways, I think the game American Nightmare is almost kind of like the first rough draft of this story. And another really
Mm-hmm.
important thematic element of Alan Wake 2, in my mind, is the idea of different drafts of the same story. And anybody that's ever spent a lot of time writing something or editing their own work can tell you that between just draft one to draft two of your own work, you might go, oh, okay, I got to change this thing because this is going to make the story way better. And then you watch as you go through that draft, and it has this ripple effect where it's like, well, because I changed this, I've got to change this, so that makes sense, and then this, and then this, and then this. And in a lot of ways, like American Nightmare is the first version of Alan Wake 2. It's a story where Mr. Scratch is the bad guy. It plays with loops of three, which is again a concept introduced in Control and even used more in this game. So Mr. Scratch is the villain. It's dealing with the concept of loops, looping environments where you're going through multiple places, manifesting the dark place as an overlap with a real world location. We wouldn't even learn what an overlap was in terms of like the terminology until this game. And yet all of those ideas are kind of seeded and set up. I mean, even in American Nightmare, there's a bit in the first area where you have to go and turn the radio on, change the spotlight, mess with the oil rig, and then changing all those things changes reality and it causes a scene to come to life. And in a lot of ways it is a prototype for the story. And I think that is in terms of story and some themes. I think that's what makes American Nightmare so interesting is that game. Mr. Scratch is this completely separate person from Alan, walking around as a different being. He's like this doppelganger, negative, all of his worst traits built up in one being. He's like this charismatic serial killer character, and you burn Mr. Scratch. You defeat him in that game. But I think the reason that story Alan wrote didn't come true is because it was not acknowledging Scratch as part of himself. And then that brings me back to Alan Wake 2 story and one of the big twists of like, oh, this Alan that Saga rescued in like chapter 1 of the game, like this is also Scratch, and he kind of has this big turn in the jail cell scene, and having this kind of almost it's very Carl Jung, this Jungian concept of the shadow, where in American Nightmare, Alan hadn't done the work to integrate his shadow, to acknowledge all these negative aspects as a part of himself. This is almost a story about denying those things and saying, oh, that's someone else that's doing that. And Alan Wake 2 is kind of a story about going like, these things are part of me. I'm going to accept them, and that's going to allow me to have control over them.
Yeah.
To jump off that, also for American Nightmare, introduces the concept of Night Springs episodes having a kernel of truth in them, which that DLC then shows a couple other potential iterations of what Alan might have wrote, framed as Night Springs episode by Mr. Dorr, who's already got this whole superliminal, subliminal space going on, with the talk show in the Allens thing, but also I believe confirmed to be the host of Night Springs in Saga's world. And yeah, so it almost ends up making that Night Springs DLC feel like an American Nightmare sequel.
Yeah, and this is the Night Springs episode right here with Mr. Dorr. Very much like a Twilight Zone there kind of homage in the game.
And it's those red curtains that David Lynch liked to use in every single thing he
made. So when you play the game, the reveal as it kind of gets further into the game there is that the murders were committed by people in the town of Bright Falls there, trying to basically protect the people because they saw these creatures kind of coming in that were possessed. And one of the people that, when you first play the game, you actually are in control of one of those people. And it was what was it, Nightingale, Officer
Nightingale.
Nightingale there, who was, if you remember in first Alan Wake game, he was the guy that was calling Alan Wake every single writer he ever knew, like Stephen King. He called him Ernest Hemingway. He called him
Stephen King is the obvious one, yeah.
Ernest Hemingway, F. Scott Fitzgerald. He called him every single popular male author ever. So he ended up, you figure out what happened to him at the end of that game. And then so that's the first person you take control of, him climbing out of the lake, and then you see the sacrifice that they do. So these people who were it was the characters were Kelso and I forgot the other guy name.
Ilmo and Yako, which are
Il-
actually played by the same actor.
Ilmo and
Mhm.
Yako there, who were people there. So they were doing these where they were cutting the heart out of them, but these creatures can't die by simply cutting the heart out of them. So they were doing it. So you see Nightingale comes back to life when he's at the morgue, and attacks Saga and attacks Alex Casey there. So that's part one of the mystery where that gets solved of who was doing these murders. Then another part of it gets revealed there that when you think Alan Wake has returned from the pit of the dark place, that is actually Mr. Scratch, and he's the guy there. What he wants to do is get control of this clicker there that they have, and then once he gets this clicker, he can rewrite reality and shape it into his own way, into his own for nefarious means. And I'll show the scene there as Sage mentioned before there of that term, which I thought was a great scene there. Where he actually does do it right there. This is a little bit right here. This jail sequence scene right here. I'll play a little bit.
We'll fix this. I'll save everyone, but we're running out of time. I need the clicker.
I have the clicker. You will fix this.
And
You
part
will
of the motivation for, Saga is like you said, she says she's trying to save her daughter because in this reality, it's that her daughter's dead and she is not with her husband anymore. And then everybody in this town of Bright Falls knows who she is, and she doesn't know who any of these people are. So it's very weird there with it.
save my daughter. Promise me.
Yes, I promise. But we're out of time. Hurry!
Don't fucking give it to him! Take him! He's a fucking monster, Saga! There it is. We've been waiting for you, motherfucker. I'm gonna fucking destroy you!
Jeez. And great reveal there with that. I thought that was really, really great there with the whole Mr. Scratch kind of element there. So you realize that Alan Wake is still stuck in the dark place right there. In a lot of what he's trying to do and trying to escape there for the most part. So you got that going on. And then also it's kind of muddled as far as then it gets into the personalities there of is Mr. Scratch. So I guess he is the same person as Alan Wake, and then Tom Zane is also in the mix, and then is Tom Zane the top personality? So it gets a little confusing there a little bit there with that.
Yeah,
And
I mean, even at one point, when you're going through the movie theater level and Alan's half the game, and a lot of it is you're following this trail of Alex Casey's investigation into Thomas Zane and into what's going on. And Alex Casey says outright that Zane is this series of endless rabbit holes. I mean, that's about as accurate as you could describe it. In the first game, Tom Zane was this big light in the diving suit, and hey, what's up, BFG? And Tom Zane is this kind of almost Deus Ex Machina, but he's got the
Mhm.
voice of Alex Casey in the first game. So, the idea maybe in the first game was like, oh, well, that was never really Thomas Zane. That was Alan wrote a version of Thomas Zane that has the voice of his character, Casey, because it's Alan writing his own Deus Ex Machina into the story. And then in this game, you get this idea that, well, Alan is somewhat clairvoyant or, capable of linking into like prophecy with his powers, very similar to what the old gods of Asgard do with their music, right? Because there's a real Alex Casey. Saga's partner is named Alex Casey. And there's this real person out there that Alan has been peeking into the mind of and peeking into the life of and taking experiences for his story. And that results in you having two whole Alex Casey characters in this game, right? You've got Alex Casey in the real world, Saga's partner, who is, a little less over the top than Max Payne, right? He doesn't speak in as pulpy, noirish of dialogue. He feels a little more relatable as like a real human being. His wife and kid were never murdered. He got divorced. He's FBI instead of being like a street cop. There's a bunch of small differences in Alex Casey versus Max Payne's life. But then in the Dark Place, as Alan, you're kind of being haunted by this version of Alex Casey that's more supposed to represent the fictional version that Alan wrote about in his books. And that version of the character is straight up Max Payne, with like no exceptions. And I think that's another beautiful element of the story. And it's R.I.P. James McCaffrey and Lance Reddick. We mentioned both him earlier as well. But I am really glad that James McCaffrey was able to return to play Alex Casey in this game, because if you take just all of the Alex Casey echoes that you find in the Dark Place as Alan, and you just stitch those together, it's kind of Max Payne 4. Just those echoes themselves kind of are telling an entire new Max Payne story. And I think it's this wonderful send off for the actor. But it also gives you this really, really great idea of how Alan's powers are actually working, because I think, especially through Control, kind of muddying the waters and making you unsure of exactly how all this works, Alan Wake 2 does a really good job at clarifying just what the extent of these powers actually are.
Yeah. What's your theory there, No Name, with the Thomas Zane, Alan Wake?
I could spin some bullshit for hours and hours, but right now I'm just writing it out. I'm so ready for what Sam is going to tell me next. In terms of trying to figure out, differences between Zane and Alan, I have a million different theories, but each of them contradicts the other, and I mean, that's honestly probably my favorite part of this game, is the amount it allows you to analyze it, and the amount that what they tell you gives you more questions than answers. By the end, we see a version of Thomas Zane that's been stuck here forever. Not literally, but for quite some time, and has perhaps been affected by the Dark Place in that time. But there, the first game will always leave that question until they decide to answer it. Is Alan just Tom? And this game deepens that, makes it less and more likely at the same time.
Yeah.
It's really it's in this weird place where, like, we get this kind of explanation in the Night Springs DLC of, how is there Jack Joyce from Quantum Break and then Tim Breaker here, and it's like, oh well, they're kind of, it's kind of like the same person in different universes. Perhaps Alan and Tom are sort of like multiverse variants of each other, right? Like perhaps they're the same person from different worlds. It's also possible that, Tom is the original and he wrote himself into a story where he was Alan Wake, and because he's in that story, he's forgotten his original identity, and so there's like layers of fiction. Separating the original version of him and this creation. I think it's also possible that there's a sort of Ouroboros effect, right? It's like the snake eating its own tail, where there's not a real start or ending to this process, and Alan Wake and Thomas Zane have, in a way, both created each other. Like we've kind of gotten this hint of Tom Zane writing Alan into existence, but maybe Alan wrote Tom into existence, but it's not just that one or the other did, but both of them have kind of created each other in this like feedback loop.
Alan wrote Tom writing Alan into existence from that page in the first game. If you want to take it, I don't know if that's surface level or deep level, but an interpretation of that page from the first game.
All I am confident about is that Tom Zane is the perhaps biggest long-term like mystery for the whole RCU. I don't think it's just something that's been set up. like I don't think it's just being something that's set up for Alan Wake 3. I think this is set up for Control 2 as well. I mean, in the first Control, you get this kind of idea that Tom Zane has been retconned from a poet to a filmmaker, but Jesse remembers him as a poet, and then certain characters remember him as a poet in Alan Wake 2 as well. Certain characters that maybe seem like
Cynthia
they're
and both Tor and Odin, I believe. And Tor and Odin
so
are the ones who call Alan Tom.
Yeah.
and then Ati also calls Alan Tom. And so it seems
Right.
like, oh, maybe there's a certain class of like supernatural power that prevents your memory from being changed by the story. But on top of that, is it a change by the story, or is there something else happening entirely here? There's so many questions that you could ask, but what I will say is I think it's not a coincidence that in Control, all of the documents that you read about the Blessed organization and Chester Bless and this whole other group of people that also seem to be connected to the board. I don't think it's any coincidence that all of those documents and all of that information is specifically in the part of the game that is literally right before you walk down the hallway that triggers that Thomas Zane cutscene for the first time. And so, I mean, I think it's entirely possible that we get into Control 2, and Tom Zane is a huge part of what's going on with the board in that game. I mean, it's possible that that's not what's going on, but he could be the whole reason for the board's existence in Control as well. I mean, it's implied even a couple times that he might have created the Ocean View Motel in the first place. Or he found it in a different world and created it in this world, and he linked the worlds together. Or again, it was his idea in the first place, and the Ocean View only exists because of him. I mean, it really could be anything and so many things at the same time.
Yeah. What you learn about Saga Anderson, like you said, legacy character. So you learn that she is the granddaughter of Thor and Odin there. And the reason why she isn't affected like most people in this town, that like she still remembers the truth, remembers her daughter being alive and her married, is because she has seer ability like Thor and Odin does there. So she has a special ability of her own. And at the end, she is able to save her daughter there because, so when Alan Wake, he learns what's kind of going on. He learns here how to more master his powers, and everything operates in the story. So it's all about writing the final draft within this type of, horror type story there. So you have to fit within the genre of it is. So he's able to write this kind of story, and that's the infamous kind of scene where he says it's not a loop, it's a spiral, which I thought was really good there, that moment there. So there is an ending to a spiral. So there is a point where he is going to get out of the dark place there. And you also see the return of his wife as well, Alan Wake's wife, Alice, as well in this, where maybe you thought that she maybe also had maybe a special ability of her own at some point there. Maybe she could have a special power there. But so she was able to escape the dark place. So Alan did save his wife. She was able to get out of the dark place, but she returned to the dark place in order to save Alan there and go back for him. And then all this time, Alan had been thinking that Mr. Scratch had been torturing Alice, that he'd been basically holding her hostage. But she actually has been working there with a game plan there to help him and having her own way there. So I thought that was very interesting. And then you mentioned kind of like this game feels like more of a setup, not for Alan Wake 3, but more for Control. And if you play the DLC specifically there, the Lake House DLC, where you play Estevez, who's the character from the FBC who comes to actually help with the event. This they call them the paranormal events there, or the
Altered World Event is like the actual like case classification, and then peri-utilitarian is like the people involved.
Yeah, so the Altered World event there. So they're there to come for the Altered World event. So you see the backstory of her and what happened when they do, because they do have an FBC post there with Brightfall. So you see what happens there, and you meet Dylan, who's the brother of Jesse, and it's kind of almost like a mini, which was cool, like a mini trailer for Control there. Before we move on, any other things you want to discuss spoiler wise?
Well, there was one interesting thing you just brought up with the whole loop spiral concept, and that's just one other potential explanation with Thomas Zane that I would like to throw out there is that perhaps it's not that they're related at all. Maybe neither of them actually created each other, but throughout time, there have to be people to fulfill archetypes. I think, as Alan kind of masters his power at the end of this game, some of the idea feels like he's almost it's and this is kind of what I imagine Alan Wake 3 being about, but it feels like he's ascending to the realm of archetypes. I mean, so much of this is about, meta storytelling and kind of how storytelling works. And so for a fictional character to master all of what they are, they're kind of ascending to the realm of an archetype. And I think that could potentially be what, rather than Tom Zane making Alan or vice versa, it could just be that Tom Zane was the last writer in the world that ascended to the realm of the writer archetype within storytelling in general, in like a broader sense. And it could be that they're not directly connected or related, but they're just the two people in a row that fit this kind of more metaphysical sense of what's a writer in a story like.
I think that what I would bring up is I love that this game fleshed out Alice more. We got so much more depth for her, which gives retroactive meaning to their dynamic in the first game. That I think Remedy always does a good job of giving, like broadening their previous works in each new iteration. And I think that they really nailed the transference between live action and gameplay in this one that we've seen early bits of. I mean, Quantum Break obviously is the big example of that. But Control as well did it. But I think that this one really felt right in the pocket there of when to switch back and forth, how to switch back and forth. And I can't wait to see what they do as they keep going with that.
And that really is what creates this multimedia experience, because like some parts of this game are a video game, some parts of it are a musical performance, some parts of it are an audiobook, some parts of it are like watching a live action TV series. And that's why I always say I think an adaptation would be really hard to do for something like this, because if you just made like a TV show or a movie based on this, well, part of it already is that thing, and it's also so many other things at the same time. How could you possibly capture that level of dynamic change in an adaptation?
100%. And that's part of why Sam Lake talks about video games potentially being the ultimate storytelling medium. You can have all of that. You got your book, you're listening to music, every single sense almost is combined or at work in all of these things.
Any final thoughts on it?
I mean,
play it.
I mean, I feel like I've rambled on a lot, so I won't go too much more. But like I said at the beginning of this, this game totally blew my expectations out of the water after waiting 13 years for it. I think Remedy as a studio is at the top of their game right now, the best that they've ever been between Control and this, like back-to-back releases. I can't wait to get my hands on their next game. And Sam, like I said, we're only just getting started with the Remedy connected universe as a whole. So even though maybe the majority of Alan Wake's story has happened now, like maybe we get a third game, maybe that's the last one. We'll see what happens. But if Alan Wake 2 is the last Alan Wake game and Alan Wake becomes more of a supporting role in future stories, we still have a lot to go. There's still a lot that they have planned here. And I mean, I think a decade plus probably at the least. So I mean, I don't know if we wanted to give ratings or not, since I guess I kind of already did previously. But if you hadn't seen my previous review, this is cinema all the way for me.
Yeah. What rating would you give it, Nona?
I would say this is cinema. I was telling Sage earlier today, I think I need to be on the channel a couple times for things I didn't like, just so I'm not. Currently my record is 2 This Is Cinema and 1 Peak, I believe. So maybe I need to come on and be more critical of some things, but yeah, this is another This Is Cinema for me.
And I might as well round it out. I think this is an amazing game on every level there. Really hard to say anything I disliked about the game. I'm still craving for some more of this. So I know they said Remedy plans to release another kind of a Remedy game basically every year. They at least want to do one Remedy game every year.
Some sort of content each year. So like Control is 2019, and then across 2020 you had both of the Control DLCs. And then there was a little bit of a break, and then you had Alan Wake 2 in 23. Across 24, you had the 2 DLCs. FBC Firebreak is supposed to be 2025, which, judging by the schedule they're going at, you could have the Max Payne remake, which is we know coming after that in 26, and that could land Control 2 in 2027, Control 2 DLC in 2028, and if there is an Alan Wake 3, 2029.
Yeah. So I also give This Is Cinema 4, Alan Wake 2. People can play it right now there. An amazing game.